The U.S. military is prepared to strike Iran as early as this weekend, sources are telling CNN. But President Trump, who has privately argued for and against strikes, has yet to make a final decision on what to do.
You know, we have a lot of ships going that direction, just in case. We have a big flotilla going in that direction.
At 0340 local time, a radar operator aboard the USS George H.W. Bush stopped breathing for exactly 3 seconds. The screen in front of him showed what he had been trained to dread. Not one contact, not 5, 47 separate tracks, all inbound, all low, all slow enough to be drones and fast enough to be a problem. The strike group's Aegis systems were already calculating intercept solutions. The math was automatic. The math was also catastrophic. 47 targets. Roughly 47 ESSM interceptors required. Each one costs $1.5 million. The total expenditure to clean the screen, just under $70 million in the next 4 minutes. And that assumed perfect intercept rates. It assumed no second wave. It assumed the group had $70 million worth of missiles left to spend. It didn't. What nobody outside the Combat Information Center knew that morning was that CVN-77 had been running escort operations in the Strait of Hormuz for 11 days straight. The destroyers flanking her had already expended a significant portion of their vertical launch cells responding to smaller probing attacks during the week prior. The strike group was deep into its magazine. Not empty, but deep. And 47 new tracks were about to make that number worse very quickly. What the radar operator also didn't know, because the crew hadn't been fully briefed, was that there was something sitting on the flight deck above him that had never sat on any carrier flight deck in the history of the United States Navy. It looked like a shipping container. It had no markings. Most of the flight crew assumed it was spare parts, generator equipment, something boring and logistical. A few petty officers had quietly speculated it was comms hardware. They were not even close. 47 nautical miles southwest, in the shallow green water between the Iranian coastline and the Omani shore, a fleet of rigid inflatable boats had spent the previous 3 hours doing nothing that looked like an attack. They were fishing. They were drifting. They were doing the ordinary nothing that small boats do at 4 in the morning in the Gulf. And then, at a signal nobody on the carrier could intercept, they stopped drifting and started launching. The drones used were a variant of the Shahed 136, Iran's one-way attack drone with a wingspan of 8 feet, a fiberglass body, and a small high-explosive warhead in the nose. Each one costs between $20,000 and $30,000 to produce. They fly at roughly 115 miles per hour. They have a range of over 1,000 miles. They don't need a pilot. They don't need a radar lock. They need a GPS coordinate and a working engine, and then they just go. Iran had spent the better part of a decade building these by the thousands because they figured out something the United States Navy was very slow to admit. The most dangerous weapon in the modern Gulf is not the one that costs the most. It's the one that costs the least and comes in the largest quantity. This is the math problem. This is the only real enemy in this story. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser carries 122 vertical launch cells. An Arleigh Burke destroyer carries 96. Every cell is loaded with a missile that took years to design, months to manufacture, and anywhere from $1 million to $32 million to produce, depending on type. The doctrine behind those cells assumes a specific kind of enemy: expensive, sophisticated, low in number. The doctrine assumes Iran sends 3 or 4 high-value cruise missiles and the Aegis system knocks them down cleanly and everyone goes home. The doctrine does not account for the enemy who sends 400 drones in rolling waves over 48 hours until every launch cell in the group is empty and the carrier has to retreat. The drone doesn't beat the missile in a fair fight. The drone beats the missile by showing up in a number so large that the missile runs out before the drone does. Imagine defending your house from a swarm of hornets using a bolt-action rifle. Every shot is perfect. You never miss. You just run out of ammunition on Hornet number 63. That is the scenario the Combat Information Center was staring at when those 47 tracks appeared on the screen. Standard doctrine called for ESSMs on the lead elements of the swarm, ram missiles on anything that broke through to close range, and phalanx as a last resort. The phalanx close-in weapons system fires 20mm tungsten rounds at 4,500 per minute. It is devastatingly effective at extremely close range. It is also a signal to everyone watching that you are out of better options. And it covers the flight deck in brass casings and fragmented shrapnel, which means every F/A-18 Super Hornet sitting on the catapults has a non-trivial chance of ingesting debris into a $62 million engine intake. The strike group's commanding officer had maybe 90 seconds to make a call before the Aegis system needed to begin expending interceptors. He didn't reach for the phone. He keyed a frequency that wasn't in the standard tactical communications handbook. A response came back from the flight deck in 11 words. Container is hot. Tracking. Ready on your mark. 300 nautical miles to the northeast. Inside a windowless office at Naval Air Systems Command in Patuxent River, Maryland, a program manager who had spent 4 years fighting the Navy's acquisition bureaucracy to get a containerized laser weapon onto a carrier was asleep. He would learn what happened next from a classified brief 2 days later and reportedly said nothing for almost a full minute afterward. The system on the deck of CVN-77 is called the Layered Laser Defense System, developed by Boeing, fielded under a modular open systems architecture that means exactly one thing in practical terms. You don't need to tear apart the ship to install it. It sits in a self-contained unit the approximate size and shape of a 20-foot shipping container. Power cables run from the container into the ship's electrical grid. No structural modifications to the hull. No dry dock. No 18-month shipyard window. You bolt it to the deck and you plug it in. And here is why the carrier specifically was the only platform in the fleet where this made any sense. A destroyer runs on gas turbine engines. A cruiser runs on gas turbines. Their electrical generating capacity is substantial but bounded. Run a high-powered laser system continuously and you are pulling from the same power budget that runs radar, communications, propulsion, and every other system on the ship. There is a ceiling. The laser has to share. CVN-77 is powered by 2 A4W nuclear reactors. Those reactors generate electrical power in quantities that make a destroyer's output look like an extension cord. A nuclear carrier at full power has enough surplus electrical generation capacity to run an entire small city and still have margin left over. When you plug a laser weapon into that grid, you are not competing with the radar for wattage. You are tapping into a source that, for practical operational purposes, does not run out. The nuclear reactor doesn't know it's powering a weapon. It doesn't care. It just keeps generating. As long as the fuel rods are hot, the laser has ammunition. Cost per engagement: approximately $1.15 in electricity consumed. The drone it is shooting down costs $25,000 to build, transport, and launch. That ratio is not a rounding error. That ratio is the entire point. The layered laser defense operates in the 60 to 150 kilowatt range in its current configuration. It is not a science fiction death ray. It does not vaporize targets in a flash of light. It works through something the engineers call thermal loading, which is exactly what it sounds like. The beam locks onto a specific point on the target, typically the wing joint, the propeller housing, or the battery compartment, and it holds there. For 2 to 4 seconds, the system pours concentrated infrared energy into a surface area roughly the size of a playing card. Think of a magnifying glass focusing August sunlight onto a dry leaf. Now give that magnifying glass the electrical output of a nuclear reactor. The fiberglass body of a Shahed variant drone has a melting point. The adhesives holding the wing assembly together have a melting point. The battery pack powering the guidance electronics has a melting point. The laser finds the lowest of those thresholds and exploits it. The wing warps. The airframe loses lift. The drone doesn't explode. It doesn't shatter. It just stops flying in a controlled direction and falls into the water. No shrapnel. No debris cloud. No detonation on or near the flight deck. The Super Hornets on the catapults never know it happened. At 0347 local time, the container on the deck of CVN-77 began engaging. The first drone in the lead element of the swarm dropped out of the sky at a range of 6 nautical miles. There was no smoke trail, no visible flash. The radar track simply stopped moving and began descending. The second drone in that element dropped 3 seconds later. Then a third, then a fourth. Inside the Combat Information Center, a petty officer who had been tracking the lead element watched 4 tracks disappear in under 15 seconds and said, out loud to no one in particular, "That's not a missile." It was not a missile. The Aegis system, which had been calculating ESSM launch solutions for all 47 tracks, began updating its threat priorities in real time. The tracks the laser was handling dropped off the intercept queue. The remaining kinetic interceptors were held in the tubes. The commanding officer watched the geometry of the engagement shift in a way he had never seen in 23 years of surface warfare. The swarm was still coming, but the math had changed. The laser cannot engage everything at once. It handles one track at a time, holding beam lock for the dwell period required to guarantee structural failure. The engagement sequence is prioritized by threat proximity and approach angle. The closest threats first. The ones with direct flight paths to the flight deck get priority over those that might pass outside the strike group's perimeter. The system is not thinking. It is executing a priority queue at a speed no human operator could replicate. Over the next 19 minutes, the layered laser defense aboard CVN-77 engaged 31 of the 47 inbound tracks. The remaining 16 were engaged by the strike group's kinetic interceptors, including 9 ESSMs from the escorts and 7 ram missiles from CVN-77's own close-in defense. All 16 of those kinetic engagements were validated kills. Total kinetic expenditure for a 47 drone attack, 16 missiles. Previous doctrine would have required a minimum of 47. In a magazine-constrained group operating after 11 days of continuous patrol, the difference between 16 and 47 interceptor rounds was the difference between a carrier that could continue operations and a carrier that had to turn around. The strike group did not turn around. Iran sent $115 worth of electricity straight to the bottom of the Arabian Sea 31 times that morning, and what they got in return was a carrier that was still fully operational and a lesson they were not expecting. The lesson was not about directed energy weapons. Iran knew those existed. The lesson was about the power source. Iran's drone doctrine was designed around the physics of a finite magazine. Every planning assumption about wearing down a carrier strike group is built on the assumption that the carrier eventually runs out of expensive interceptors and has to retreat or accept hits. That assumption required the carrier's defensive ammunition to be expensive and finite. The laser made one layer of that ammunition cost nothing and last forever. The entire attrition strategy lost its mathematical foundation in 19 minutes. Somewhere in Tehran, the general who signed the launch order for 115 drone strikes over 11 days was doing math that no longer worked. 300 nautical miles to the northeast, the program manager in Maryland woke up to a message that said, simply, data from last night confirms successful engagement. Recommend accelerated fleet integration. He read it twice. Then he called his program office and told them to clear the calendar. The container was not a secret weapon. It was a physics correction. For 50 years, naval warfare operated on the assumption that the most sophisticated, most expensive, most precisely engineered weapon system always wins. The Aegis combat system is the pinnacle of that doctrine. It is arguably the most capable shipborne air defense architecture ever built. It is nearly perfect. The problem with nearly perfect is that nearly perfect costs $1.5 million every time it fires. The drone discovered that perfection has a budget. The laser doesn't replace the Aegis. It doesn't replace the YSSM. It doesn't replace the RAM or the phalanx or any other layer in the carrier's defensive architecture. It sits underneath all of those layers and handles the category of threat those systems were never economically designed to engage. It takes the $25,000 problem off the $1.5 million solutions plate and handles it for the price of a light bulb left on for an afternoon. The carrier is now a more intelligent weapon than it was on April 18th. Not more powerful, more intelligent. There is a difference, and the difference matters more than any range specification or warhead yield. The flight deck of CVN-77 cleared for flight operations at 0423 local time, 40 minutes after a 47 drone swarm attack on the most valuable naval asset in the United States fleet. Super Hornets were on the catapults. Iran took their best swing at the shiniest target in the Gulf and bought themselves 40 minutes of empty sky. The container is still bolted to the deck. It still has no markings. The flight crew still walks past it every day. Most of them know exactly what it is now. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on the Aegis combat system and how the Navy's most complex radar is being pushed to its absolute limits by the modern drone era. Bye for now.